How's everybody doing? Good. All right, I'm excited. We are in our series on Joseph, this character from the Old Testament, this man of God who tried to live into the dreams that God had given him. It's a great story because I think it helps us live what my goal is for all of us. You know, my goal, our goal, the church's goal is that you would find hope and follow Jesus, that you would grow to become more like him over time. And part of that is realizing who you are, how you're gifted, and living into those gifts and dreams that God has for you. Ephesians chapter 2 says that he's actually orchestrated you, that you're his masterpiece or poem or work of art, and that he's given you unique gifts to do the things that he's called you to do. And so I'm excited for us to live into that because we learn so much from Joseph. Joseph had a literal dream. Like God gave him an actual dream of his family members bowing down to him. I don't know what dream he's given you or the things that he's placed in your heart or the gifts, but we talked about on the first week that with that almost always comes obstacles. Sometimes we have the false assumption that if God has me to do something, it's going to be easy. But throughout Scripture, we see time and time again, there's still obstacles when we pursue what God has called us to do. And then we talked about how he's betrayed by his own family. Pastor Abigail preached a great message on bouncing back from betrayal. How do we keep moving forward when it seems like people are fighting against us? And then last week, we talked about not getting distracted. Because how many of you know, if you're called to do something, if God's leading you in a direction, the enemy wants to distract you. He wants to derail you. He wants to tempt you. So we talked about how Potiphar's thirsty wife wanted to distract him. She was like, come on. And he's like, no way. And he saw these three things. We talked about them last week. He saw the cost. The giving in to this distraction, this temptation, this thing outside of God's plan for me is going to cost me more than I'm willing to pay. He saw the assignment. God, you've called me to something. I'm going to focus on that. And he saw the exit. He looked for the way out. God will always give you a way out so that you can live the life he's calling you to live. We're following Joseph's journey from the prison to the palace, in Potiphar's house, in all of these different moments. It seems like lots of ups followed by many downs. I don't know if you've ever felt like that. Like life is like up and then down. It's like I'm moving towards this thing. Oh, I think this could be the thing. And then there's a step back. You're like, God, we're moving. Like this is probably how you're going to do that thing. And then you move the wrong direction. His brothers, the ones that he thinks are somebody going to bow down to him, sold him into slavery. And then he serves and then he gets promoted and he's doing great. And then he gets thrown into prison. That's where we left off last week. Potiphar's upset. He's angry, as makes sense. His wife tells him the false story that Joseph came after her, so he throws him in prison. It kind of makes me think about how often living into the life God has called us to live requires waiting. You know, Joseph, this has been a few years now that he's been in Potiphar's household, and we'll learn today that he ends up spending 10 years in prison. That's a long time. 10 years for something he didn't even do. Trying to just be obedient to God. God, I'm just going to be faithful in whatever season you put me in. I'm just going to do this thing in 10 years of waiting. Anybody love to wait? No, none of it. No, who loves to wait? This is the reason that everybody hates the DMV, right? The worst part about the DMV is just waiting. Nobody wants to sit there and just wait. Or I don't know about you, but my whole timeline on how long a package should take to get to my house has changed. Like, because a long time ago, if something came in a week, that was like, whoa, we can order this thing and it like shows up at our house. Some of you are old like me or older than me, and you understand that. Some of you are like, what? There was such thing as like a time when there was no 2-day shipping, next day shipping. Like sometimes you order stuff and it comes like 2 hours later. But now when it doesn't, I'm like frustrated. I'm like, what is taking so long? We hate waiting. Like all of us. You guys know, you're driving down Randall. Am I the only one? You're always looking ahead at which lane up to the next light has less cards, and you're just switching back and forth, and you're memorizing the car next to you to be like, did I make the right choice? Like, are they going to get ahead of me? You guys all have problems just like I do. We have waiting problems, but waiting is part of how we grow. That God is always working in the waiting. And this is Psalm 27. David says, I remain confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. David's like, I have this picture that I will see the things that God has for me. He's like, I will see them someday. But the next verse says, wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. He repeats it twice. He's like, wait. He's like, you have this thing that you feel like God is leading you to, but it's going to take time. Waiting is part of the process. Or this in Lamentations, the Lord is good to those whose hope is in him. Hope, what a good word. Find hope. Follow Jesus. The Lord is good. Anybody want God to be good to you? The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. Waiting on God's rescue, waiting on God's timing, waiting on God's plan, waiting on God is always part of how God develops you and grows you. It's just a part that we don't like. Or Isaiah 40, even the youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. Who has that strength? Those who wait on the Lord. Waiting is part of the process. And we don't like waiting. I mean, maybe some of you are waiting for a spouse. You're waiting for that person God has for you, or you're waiting for your spouse to be a different person that you feel God has for you. Not leaving them, but you just want God to do a little thing in their life. And you're or maybe you're waiting on a job. You're waiting on some sort of provision. God, I feel like you have something for me. I'm stuck at this place. Or you're waiting on a child, or you're waiting on a child to come back, that prodigal in your life, or you're waiting for healing. You're waiting for direction. You're waiting for something. All of us find ourselves often in waiting seasons. God, this is taking longer than I thought it would. I'm waiting, God. God is working in the waiting. And we hear that and we sing that. But I think it's a good question to ask, what do we do in the waiting? What are we supposed to do? You're he was about to start there. Because that's the thing. It's always longer than you think it's going to be. You're I think he's going to start now. This has been long enough. I get the illustration. It's always longer. It's always longer than you want it to be. So what do we actually do while we wait? Because I don't think we're just supposed to wait and just be completely uninvolved in the process. I think there are things we should be doing while we're waiting on God. And we're going to be looking at Joseph's story to answer some of those things. And the first one is this. They all start with F. There's 4 of them. Be faithful. Be faithful in the waiting. Be willing to do the things that you have to do later. Be doing them now. Read this in Genesis, starting in verse 19. When his master heard the story of his wife had told him, he said, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. That's Potiphar. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He at least put him in a nice prison. This was one of the better ones. It's the one where the king's prisoners were. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. Isn't that comforting? That even in the setback, even in the waiting, even when the thing seems to go up and then comes back down, God is still with you. In the waiting, when things look hard, when it looks like, how is God with me now when everything seems to be moving the wrong direction? God is still with you. He has not left you. He will not forsake you. God was with him, and he showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all of those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Doesn't that sound familiar? Didn't this just happen in the last chapter? He was in Potiphar's household, and he was faithful. And he rose up to the second in command, and Potiphar had to think about nothing except what he was going to eat because Joseph had it covered. And now Joseph faces a setback, but lives the same consistent, faithful life. I'm still going to use my leadership gifts. I'm still going to be faithful. I'm not going to check out. I'm going to keep doing what God has asked me to do. And he raises up even in prison to the point where the guy actually in charge isn't doing anything. Joseph's running that place. He's using his gifts. I think this is important. We need to find ways to do the things that God has asked us to do later, now. We need to use our gifts even if it doesn't look like that place or opportunity or thing that we're waiting for. Because I think sometimes we're no, I will do that when I'm there. I'll be generous later in life, or I will care about these people when I can differently, or I will use this gift of administration or speaking or whatever it is. I will use it then, but we're unwilling to use it now because it doesn't look like what we pictured. It doesn't look like the opportunity we feel like God is calling us to. But here's the thing, is I think if you're unwilling to do it when no one is noticing, it's not really about that. It's about the recognition. That there's something inside of you that actually wants the platform or the spotlight in your organization, in your field, in your career, or whatever it is. You want that more than you actually just want to faithfully do what God's asked you to do. But God always looks at faithfulness. He promotes faithfulness. And like if you think about the sporting world or whatever it might be, you might have a certain amount of raw talent, but unless you put in the work, like you can't get to that place. We love overnight success stories, but really there's not many true overnight success stories. Most of them have put in countless hours of work and dedication, faithfully using their gift before anyone saw it. Because Joseph, if you know the story, in a couple chapters, is going to be number 2 over all of Egypt. He is going to be Pharaoh's right-hand man, leading, organizing, planning ahead, saving not only Egypt, but the surrounding areas because of his leadership and wisdom. You know when the first time Joseph shows leadership is? It's not in Egypt at Pharaoh's side. It's not even in the prison. It started at Potiphar's house. He's been faithful to do what God has called him to do far before he ever saw what God told him would happen. The first thing we need to do is be faithful, using our gifts. We want to serve at that highest level. We want the palace of whatever that is that we feel God has called us to in our life, in our organization, in our family, in our relationships, but we're unwilling to be faithful in the prison or in the pit. I also love how he's willing to serve others. If you keep reading, and you get to chapter 40, it says, sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master. And if you know a little bit about the story, or if you know a little bit about this time period in Egypt, the cupbearer was like security. They would drink that thing to make sure nobody was hurting Pharaoh or had poisoned it. So these were officials. These were important people. And they got thrown in. He was angry with them. He put them in custody in the house of the captain of guard, the same prison where Joseph was. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the 2 men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night. And each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. This is important. This is an easy part of the story just to read right past, but that little verse 6, shows Joseph's heart. He didn't just lead them, he cared about them. He noticed that they were dejected. Do you know what? It's hard to notice when other people are upset when you're so consumed with what you're upset about. Like, it's really hard to show compassion and empathy for others when only you can see your own problems and your own things that you're going through. But Joseph was a healthy enough person that even though he had been betrayed, sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused and thrown in prison by the person he was serving, he still was faithful in the prison and didn't become the victim. He still cared about those around him. He said, hey, I noticed you're upset. You guys are dejected. He cared about them. I think this is such an important thing. I've had so many conversations with my friends about this, is that one of the best things you can do when you're upset is serve somebody else. Your problems will seem smaller when you help other people with their problems. It doesn't make your problem go away. It doesn't fix anything, but it does something inside of you because I think it's how God created us. He created us to not just be consumed with ourselves, but to actually love God and love others. Oh, that sounds familiar, right? That's the great commandment. Jesus said, hey, if you're going to boil every law, every rule, everything in the Old Testament into these 2 things, it's love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. The second thing is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. I think how we live out the Christian life is turning the focus away from us, first to God and then to the people around us. How can I love you? How can I serve you? This is good. This is what Proverbs is talking about. It says, a generous person will prosper, and whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. I don't know about you, there are many seasons, I come in and out of them regularly, where I need refreshment. God, I need you to breathe some life into me. I'm discouraged, I'm down, I'm anxious, I'm frustrated, I'm whatever it is. You know what wisdom says in the book of Proverbs? Go refresh somebody else. Go invest in somebody else's life. Joseph, even though he was in the middle of his own waiting, in the middle of his own problems, says, hey guys, I notice you're upset. What's going on? He asked Pharaoh's officials in verse 7, who were in custody of him, why do you look so sad today? He didn't just notice it, he did something about it. Why do you look so sad today? That's verse 7. I think Jesus was so others focused. We see that in the gospel. I think part of being faithful when we're in those seasons of waiting is using our gifts, but also it's just serving others with those gifts. It's not even about us. It's looking for opportunities to refresh and be a blessing to others. So we're asking that question, what do we do in the waiting? The first thing, be faithful, serve, use your gifts, be generous. The second thing, be formed. Be formed. Allow God to form you in that time. After Joseph asks that question, why do you look sad today? This is how they answer. We both had dreams, they said, but there is no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. His faith level up. He's like, God can do this. It's not about me, it's about God. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, in my dream, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand. So he explains his dream, and I love this because I don't know. Dreams are so fun in the Old Testament. There's so many stories of dreams. Like one of my favorite ones is like the Gideon one. They're like this random dream and they're like, this is what it means. And it's like, how did you get there? Like it had to be from God, that interpretation, because it seemed crazy. It's like one of those dreams you had. You're like, I probably just ate something the night before. Like last night, I told Abigail this morning. I had a dream last night that I preached really short today, but that's not going to happen. So anyway, he explains the dream. Joseph, in verse 12, this is what it means. Joseph said to him, the 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. I love this. Joseph's just practical. He's like, hey, this is what it means. This is going to be really good for you. He's like, can you just remember me? Like, can you remember this moment? You remember how I treated you? Can you remember that I was nice to you and said, how are you doing? And I interpreted your dreams. Mention it to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in the dungeon. He's just like, really simply, I should not be here. Can you just remember me? Then the baker's like, well, that sounds great. That guy's getting his job back. Maybe I should share my dream too. So then in verse 16, when the chief baker saw that Joseph had given him a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh. Graphic. Not what he was expecting either. He's like, that guy was awesome. He got his job back. And then in verse 20, the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted his heads of the officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that once again he put the cup into Pharaoh's hands, but he impaled the chief baker just as Joseph had said in his interpretation. This is also similar to part 1, the be faithful. Like Joseph is using his gifts of dream interpretation now. Later, he's going to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, which is what changes the rest of the story. It changes and becomes the way that his people, his family are saved, that Egypt is saved, that God uses it, that his dream that God gave him chapters and chapters ago is now fulfilled. He's being faithful now and being formed now. He's using those gifts. It's training ground. We kind of talked about this too, where he's using his leadership gift. What's really interesting, I learned this for the first time this year, that Egyptian prisons were some of the first prisons, period. There weren't nobody else was doing this. If you did something bad, punishment was severe, kind of like the baker. It's just like ended things often, or some sort of monetary fine. But Egypt was like, we're going to start these prisons, but while you're there, we're going to educate you. This became part of the system, that you would be in prison, the teachers would go around to teach in different areas, and then they would make their stop at the prisons and educate them. Joseph, being there for 10 years, was getting an excellent education in Egyptian culture and customs and leadership, that God actually was preparing him to lead in a different capacity than he ever could have before. I think sometimes we want to rush to that place that we feel God calling us, but we don't understand that in the waiting is often where we're formed. That often we're not prepared for that thing God has for us next. I love reading stories, watching movies, hearing interviews of people like far ahead in their career, people who've made it in some sort of way, and hearing those early days, hearing those things that most people don't know about, the formation and what happened. And obviously as a pastor, I'm drawn to hearing like spiritual biographies and people I look up to, and those from a long time ago and also those more recently. I was listening to an interview the other day with Mark Batterson. If any of you know that name, he's the guy who wrote Circle Maker. Abigail and I have had the opportunity to meet him a couple times. He's part of our network and our fellowship. But he leads an awesome church in Washington, D.C. It's called National Community Church. It's a great church. It's huge. It's thriving. It has a big impact and influence. But he was talking about those early days. They planted that church. And in fact, they actually planted a church in the Chicago suburbs first. They planted a church and it failed. It died here. And then they're like, but we still feel like God's calling us to do this. And they went to DC, planted this church, super faithful, going through, just pouring their hearts out to the people. And it was a good, healthy church, but it was unrecognizable to the church that it is today. He's like, in the early days, we'd have an offering, and the whole month it would be $2,000. And now they own blocks of property in Washington, D.C., which is so expensive. He's like, we could barely cover rent of the place we were at. Barely making it. They had a couple hundred people in the room. He's just like, I've just been the same person the whole time. He's like, but looking back, I would never want overnight success. He's like, I learned so much. He goes, I feel like I was developed more in that season than anything else. He's like, I would not be able to handle what God has entrusted to me today if I didn't go through that process. And I think that's just so many stories. If we look at the healthy people who are doing what God has called them to do in any sphere of influence, it's people who just were being faithful and being formed. I'm going to do what God's asking me to do, and I'm going to allow him to shape me into the person he's making me. It's that slow and steady mentality. We overestimate the short term, and we underestimate the long term. I think a good question to ask is, in seasons of waiting, God, what are you teaching me? What are you showing me? What should I be learning right now that I'm going to need later? Joseph, leadership, dream interpretation. Like, he's becoming the person that God has for him in this next chapter of the story. And I think this is part of the maturing process. That when we're being formed, there's a shift in Joseph from when he first receives that dream. Although the dream is true and we see it fulfilled, I think his understanding of it changes. Because at first, he was the focus of the dream. Like, he focused more on his brothers bowing down to him, and it seemed to be something that he kind of liked. He was always sharing it with them. I've had this dream more than once, guys, and they're like, yeah, we know, we hate you for it. But by the end of the story, when the dream is actually fulfilled, it's no longer about him. He's like, God meant this the whole time for your good, for the good of those around me. He used what others have meant as evil in my life for good. That part of the maturing process is realizing the things that God has you called to are not even about you. But that only happens when you allow him to form you in the waiting. Don't waste this time. Be formed. Be faithful. The next thing is build friendships. The kingdom of God works in relationships. Like, that's how he does everything. Like, Jesus raised up 12 guys. He didn't start an organization. He wasn't like, we're going to do this objective thing. Like, he had goals. He started the church that exists today, but he did it through relationship. And God is always building the kingdom through relationships. And I think that often when we're in seasons of waiting, when things are frustrating or when we feel stuck, we want to isolate, but really that's when we need to lean into each other. You've heard me talk about this before, like, show me your friends, I'll show you your future. Like, God will shape you by the people he puts around you, and it's important to lean into those relationships because you don't know how that story will end. You don't know how he's going to shape you. It's because if you go to the end of chapter 39, he does interpret both those dreams, and they get restored. One of them gets restored, and the other one, it doesn't end well. But then 2 years pass, which is a bummer. Because you're like, if you're Joseph, you're thinking like, I was so nice to them, and I interpreted their dream, and they're back in the palace, and you're wondering those first few nights, you're like, I'm probably going to get a call soon. Probably going to get that text message. I'm probably going to, one of Pharaoh's guys is going to show up. But then time passes, and you're like, that's probably not going to happen. 2 years pass, and in verse 9 it says, finally the king's chief cupbearer spoke up. Because what happened was Pharaoh had these dreams. And then the guy's like, oh yeah, there was a guy I knew in prison. Today I have been reminded of my failure, he told Pharaoh. Some time ago, you were angry with the chief baker and me, and you imprisoned us in the palace of the captain guard. One night, the chief baker and I each had our own dream. He kind of shares the story with Pharaoh. And he's like, everything happened just as Joseph said. He's like, he's your guy. You had these dreams. You need Joseph. And what's interesting is this would not have worked out if Joseph didn't intentionally build those relationships. Building relationships, building friendships is one of the things you should do in the waiting. It'll help you when you're down. People can point you to the truth. They can encourage you. And you don't know how God will use it in the future. God's kingdom is built on relationships. That's our story. I mean, when I reflect back on how I got to where I am today, it is only by the grace of God and the relationships that he's put around me. I have never even applied for a ministry position. Or I have. I've never had a ministry position that I've gotten because I applied. In college, I was looking for an internship in ministry. I got that through a relationship. Somebody was like, hey, this church connected, and I went and I served, and I learned so much. It was really different than the church experience I grew up in. Really good for me, helped shape me. I got back. We meet each other. We fall in love. Relationship, important part of the story. Building friendships. We feel like God speaks to us about church planning before we even get married. We're like, I don't know what that means or when that will happen. We meet through a God story some church planners right after we get married. God says, go help them. We're like, okay, we don't have money. How are we going to go help them? But we're obedient. We're just going to use our gifts. We're going to use this as time to be formed. We're going to be faithful even when we don't know what this looks like. And through that relationship, we get connected to the church multiplication network. We get all of our ministry experience has just happened through relationships. Coaching that we now do. We serve as the reps for the Illinois region and the Greater Lakes region to help coach other church planners. All of that was just through relationship. People in our lives who we said, we're here to serve you, we believe in what God's doing, just would call us up and be like, hey, will you do this? And we just say yes. I think so often we underestimate the importance of relationships because this sounds really practical, but when you feel stuck, you don't want to make friends. When you're frustrated with God, you don't want somebody else who's got the joy of the Lord and they're leaning on him. You don't want to be around those people, but that's when you need to. You need to be faithful. You need to be formed. You need to build friendships. And you need to grow your faith. This season of waiting is where faith is built. You don't have to trust when that thing is right there. When what you're looking for is in front of you, it takes no faith. It just takes gratitude. But when you don't have what you're waiting for, that's when you can see, do I actually have faith in God, in his promises, in his character, in his nature? It's only in the waiting that your faith is both tested and grown. The chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph for 2 years. And then all of a sudden he's like, oh yeah. Joseph could have given up in that time. He could have quit, but he remained faithful. He was formed, he built friendships, and his faith was stronger, I believe, than when he started. Our faith grows in times of waiting. I don't think that's the most comfortable way for us to grow, but it's a necessary part. Because if our goal is actually to become more like Jesus, that we don't want to just find hope in who he is and what he promises, but we actually want to follow him and become more like him, waiting and opposition and the things that Joseph experienced, we'll experience in our own version, in our own life. But don't let it derail you. Don't get distracted. Don't give up on betrayal. Hold on to faith. Be formed. Be faithful. Trust in God. Let your faith grow stronger. Trust that God's timing is good. I think your faith grows as you fight fear, as you spend time with God. I think that's an important part, is just not just growing any relationship, but also growing that relationship with Jesus. When you remember his past faithfulness, it encourages you for the current thing you're facing. And God is faithful. His timing isn't always what we want it to be or expect it to be, but he always follows through on his promises. This is Habakkuk chapter 2. It says, then the Lord replied, write down the revelation, this vision, write it down and make it plain on tablets so that the herald may run with it. This is a great leadership and life principle, is that when God speaks something to you, write it down. Like, mark that moment. He's like, write down the revelation, write down the vision, whatever God gives you, journal it, put it somewhere, make it plain so that you can move towards it, so the herald can run with it. And then he says in verse 3, for the revelation awaits an appointed time. In this Habakkuk story, God's like, write it down, be ready, but it's not yet time. In Joseph's story, I have this dream for you, Joseph, that one day you will have influence and people, your family will need you and look to you, but there's a long process in between. He has given things that he's spoken through his word, by his spirit and community that he's placed in your heart. You have things that you are waiting on God for, and I just want you to write it down, but understand that it doesn't mean that it's for right now. Be patient in the waiting. Be willing to be formed, be faithful, use your gifts. He says, for the revelation awaits the appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it will linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. This is one specific example of God saying, I will be faithful. But if you read scripture, he always fulfills his promises. I don't know if it will look exactly as you expect. I don't know what the process will be like along the way, but you can trust that God is faithful. His timing is good. I can't help as we get into close to the holiday season. I know everybody's like, don't jump Thanksgiving to get to Christmas. I love Christmas. We've already been listening to Christmas music. We listened to Christmas music all night last night while we were playing games with the family. And one thing I love about Christmas is that that was the exact moment God decided to step into the story. He was already part of the story. And have you ever thought about that where you're like, he could have sent Jesus at any point. Like Adam and Eve could have sinned and he could have been like, boom, Jesus, come. Like fix it right away. But he didn't. And it was intentional. Because in Galatians 4:4, it says, when the time was right, when the right time came, at the appointed time, some translations say, God sent his son, born of a woman, subject to the law. See, God knows the story beginning from end. He knows what he's doing in your life. He knows the other pieces. I think sometimes it's waiting on us. We still have some formation to do. We have some change to make. Sometimes it's the situation. If Joseph was in the palace at a different time, it wouldn't have been the right time for the famine. Like, he was promoted at the exact time he needed to get things ready. Like, it could be the situation. It could be another person. Sometimes I'm speaking to somebody who's like, I'm waiting on a spouse. I'm like, make sure that you're becoming the person, but also, what if God's preparing them? Like, what if they're not ready? I don't know what God is doing, but when the right time came, God sent his son. And I believe that for your situation. I don't know what you're going through, but trust in God's timing. Trust in God. Be formed, be faithful, use your gifts. To have faith and trust God is to trust God's timing. We need to trust him. Let's stand and sing together.